Hello. Welcome back to STM Narratives. Before we begin, please comment where you are watching from and the time. Let's spread kindness all over the world. The early afternoon sun bathed the park in warm golden light. The park itself was an oasis, a lush slice of green set amidst the city's monotony of steel and concrete. Children played in the distance, their laughter floating through the air like cheerful echoes, while joggers circled the winding paths, moving to the rhythmic sound of their sneakers hitting the pavement. Birds sang above, nestled in the treetops, as the leaves danced in a soft breeze. Amidst this idyllic scene, no one could have imagined that something sinister was about to unfold. On the far side of the park, near a quiet bench beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, sat a little girl named Aisha. She was no older than 8, her skin the color of deep mahogany, with tightly coiled curls that framed her delicate face. She wore a light blue dress adorned with tiny daisies, her small feet dangling just above the ground from her wheelchair. Aisha was bright and joyful despite her disability, her paralyzed legs the result of a car accident 2 years ago. Since the incident, her life had shifted in many ways, but her spirit had remained indomitable. The park was her escape, a place where she felt free, even if she couldn't run with the other children. Beside her was her mother, Naomi. A tall woman in her mid-30s, Naomi's dark brown skin glistened in the sunlight, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had faced many challenges in life. She was fiercely protective of her daughter, and today was no different. Naomi had been sitting beside Aisha, her eyes scanning the park, making sure everything was okay before she stepped away for a moment to retrieve a water bottle from her bag. Her long, curly hair was tied back, and she wore a simple, comfortable dress, her aura exuding calm but vigilance. As Naomi stood up, heading to a nearby fountain, 2 police officers, both tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in their navy blue uniforms, began to approach Aisha. Their names were Officers Jensen and Marks, and their mere presence cast a shadow over the otherwise serene park. Jensen, a burly man with a closely shaved head and hard, cold eyes, led the way, while Marks, leaner with dark hair slicked back, followed a few steps behind. The two had been patrolling the area, their eyes trained on anyone they deemed suspicious. In their minds, Aisha fit that category. Jensen's eyes narrowed as he scanned the little girl in the wheelchair, his gaze hardening. He didn't see an innocent child enjoying the sun. Instead, all he saw was her skin color. Without hesitation, he motioned to Marks, who stepped forward with a smirk playing on his lips. Aisha, who had been adjusting the blanket draped over her legs, looked up with wide eyes as the officers approached. "Hey, kid," Jensen barked, his voice a gravelly command. "What are you doing here all alone?" Aisha's heart began to race. She had been taught by her mother to be cautious around authority figures, but she had never expected to be approached like this, by officers with no kindness in their tone. She swallowed nervously, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of her wheelchair. "I'm just waiting for my mom," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jensen exchanged a glance with Marks, who chuckled. "Yeah, right," Marks sneered, crouching down to be at eye level with her. "And where's your mom, kid? Or are you just making that up?" Aisha's breath hitched. She glanced toward the fountain, but her mother was still out of sight. She wasn't used to this, being interrogated, especially by men in uniforms. She's right over there," Aisha stammered, motioning weakly with her hand. "Sure, she is," Jensen growled, stepping closer, his massive form looming over her. "What's in that bag? Drugs? Stolen goods?" Tears welled up in Aisha's eyes. She had no idea why they were treating her like this. She had done nothing wrong, but the way they looked at her, with suspicion and contempt, made her feel like she had. She shook her head, her voice faltering. "And no, I don't have anything," Mark smirked, reaching for the small backpack hanging from the side of her wheelchair. "Let's see for ourselves, huh?" Just as Marks's hand reached for the bag, a commanding voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Naomi was back. Her voice was sharp, filled with the kind of protective rage only a mother could muster. She marched toward the officers, her eyes blazing with fury. "Get your hands off my daughter," The officers turned, both looking momentarily taken aback by the intensity of Naomi's presence. But Jensen quickly recovered, sneering. "We're conducting an investigation, ma'am. Step back." "Investigation?" Naomi's voice rose, incredulous. "She's an 8-year-old girl sitting in the park. What could you possibly be investigating?" Mark straightened up, his smirk fading. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," he lied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Just doing our job." Naomi stepped between the officers and her daughter, her body a shield. "I've been sitting right here the entire time. There's nothing suspicious about a little girl in a wheelchair enjoying the park. You're harassing her." Jensen's eyes flashed with irritation. "I'd advise you to calm down, ma'am. We don't want any trouble." But Naomi wasn't backing down. She could see through them, their thinly veiled racism, their abuse of authority. She knew they weren't here for any real investigation. They were here to intimidate, to exercise power over those they saw as weak and different. Her voice shook, but it remained steady, unwavering. "You're the ones causing trouble. You think you can bully my child because of the color of her skin and because she's disabled? Not on my watch." Behind them, unnoticed by the officers, a small crowd had begun to gather. Among the onlookers was an older man, his sharp eyes watching from a distance. His name was Richard Blake, a retired judge with a reputation for being a fierce advocate for justice. He had been strolling through the park when the commotion caught his attention. Blake wasn't one to intervene lightly, but the scene unfolding before him was one he couldn't ignore. As Naomi and the officers argued, Blake discreetly pulled out his phone, recording the interaction. His years on the bench had taught him that sometimes the most powerful tool in the fight for justice was simply to shine a light on injustice. He knew the power of evidence, and in this case, it was clear that these officers were abusing their authority. Meanwhile, Naomi continued to stand her ground. "You're not searching her, and you're not laying another finger on her. If you have a problem, you deal with me." Jensen's patience was wearing thin. His hand twitched near his belt, where his radio sat. He was about to call for backup when Blake stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Officers," he said, making his presence known. "What seems to be the problem here?" Jensen turned to face him, his expression hardening. "Who are you?" "Richard Blake," the man replied evenly, meeting Jensen's gaze without flinching. "Former judge of the Superior Court." A flicker of recognition crossed Marks's face. Blake was well known in the legal community, and his presence shifted the atmosphere immediately. The officers exchanged a look, the bravado slipping from their faces. Blake continued, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "I've been watching the whole incident, and I must say, I'm deeply concerned by your conduct. This child," he gestured to Aisha, who was now clinging to her mother, "has done nothing to warrant this kind of treatment. Your behavior is not only unprofessional, but it borders on harassment." Jensen's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to argue with a retired judge. "We were just responding to a call," he muttered, his voice less confident now. "I didn't hear any radios go off," Blake replied smoothly, his sharp gaze never leaving the officers. "And even if you did have a call, your approach was inappropriate, to say the least. I'll be filing a formal complaint." Marks shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we didn't mean any harm." "No harm?" Naomi's voice cracked, her eyes brimming with tears. "You terrified my daughter. You treated her like a criminal for sitting in a park. How is that not harm?" Blake nodded in agreement. "This isn't going to go unnoticed," he said quietly. "I've recorded everything. You'd be wise to apologize and leave before this situation escalates further." Jensen and Marks, now realizing they had no way out, exchanged a tense glance. Jensen's face hardened, but he knew when he was beaten. With a stiff nod, he muttered, "Let's go." Without another word, the officers turned and walked away, their posture rigid, their authority punctured. Naomi held Aisha close, kissing the top of her head as tears streamed down her face. The adrenaline slowly began to fade, leaving her shaken but resolute. She looked up at Blake, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Blake smiled warmly, his gaze softening. "No need to thank me. I just did what was right. If more people stood up against injustice, Maybe this world would be a better place. Naomi nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. As she wheeled Aisha away from the scene, the sun still shining, the birds still singing, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let anyone, no matter their uniform or authority, make her daughter feel small or afraid again. And thanks to the kindness of a stranger who had been watching, she didn't have to face that fight alone.